Hey, this is John Hoffs. I'm going to review the movie The Only Game in Town, which was made in 1969, directed by George Stevens, and starring Warren Beatty and Elizabeth Taylor. This reviewing of The Only Game in Town came upon as a result of watching a classic of 19 years earlier, 20 years earlier, which was A Place in the Sun, with the teenage Elizabeth Taylor. Here, she plays a 37-year-old divorced or single woman living alone in Las Vegas. And Warren Beatty is the 32-year-old lover who sort of finagles her into marriage. He's a piano player in Las Vegas at a kind of second-rate piano bar. She's a kind of aging showgirl in a review, big review on the Strip. And as she walks home each night, she lives in an apartment a few blocks away from the casino that she works at. And her apartment overlooks the back of the Strip and the airport. So there are jets that fly very close to her apartment, sort of symbolizing her impoverishment, that she can only afford an apartment with such noise. And we never do see where Warren Beatty lives. I just realized the movie opens with her on a whim going into the piano bar and watching him play, and them somehow hitting it off and going back to her place, where he says in a very 1969 fashion, you know, "What do I need to do to get you in bed?" And she's like, "Well, you can carry me." And it's a very it's a romantic comedy, perhaps. Comedy is always a word I don't like to add onto movies that aren't really comedies, because it's really a drama, a romantic drama with some humor in it. Warren Beatty is very funny in the part. I mean, he's playing a funny guy. His biggest issue is that he's a compulsive and chronic gambler whose goal is to leave Las Vegas as soon as he can put together $5,000. Well, he always goes and gambles and plays craps, and he's up and he's down, he's up and he's down. And even in the span of 2 or 3 days that the movie takes place, he's up 8,000, and he's broke, sells his car and his watch, and then he's up 22,000 at the end, which is enough for him to get out of town. He says, when he asks her to marry him, she says, "Why do you want to marry me?" And he says, "Well, it's the only game in town." And it literally, this shows how gullible I am, naive. It finally hit me that the only game in town isn't just gambling, it's marriage. Because the movie, which was shot beautifully, a lot of it was on sound stages in Paris, due to Elizabeth Taylor's husband Burton shooting in Paris and insisting that he be near her, since they were like Hollywood royalty. What they wanted was usually achieved. So, however, there are some location shots, mostly at night. Some of them are spectacular, although rather brief footage of the Strip in Vegas, when the hotels, the Sands, the Dunes, Caesar's Palace, were all just lined up in the beauty of the glory of their mid-50s architecture, and the neon signs is just so iconic, to use a word that I don't like to use because it's used so overly. The movie it brought to mind something that the critic Andrew Serra said about John Ford's 1963 movie Donovan's Reef, that it was a, quote, old man's picture. And Stevens was 65 when this movie was made. It would be his last movie. I think it was his attempt to be contemporary, to be hip. I liked the movie a lot, but I see what some of the criticisms were. It's fascinating to watch Elizabeth Taylor, and even in this role, see that something of her appeal had been lost. And it turns out that it was at the early, relatively young age of 37, this would be her last significant movie role. That's sad. The movie is very sad. It's about, like, you could say, the idea of losing and winning, and being a loser and then being a winner. All I could say is, my fondness for George Stevens, and I say that my review of his 1970 release, The Only Game in Town, is that George Stevens is a winner. Until my next review, this is John Hoffs. I'll see you at the cinema.